region that lieth round about. And there they preached the gospel.
All right, thank you, Brother Doyle. So here we have them at Iconium, okay, and they're preaching and teaching again, facing persecution. But again, we talked about that. Didn't stop them. They decided to, well, you don't like it, we're going to stay there anyway. Continue to preach the gospel. So with that long time preaching, again, we talked about how the preaching the truth is going to bring division. So in part 4, they were divided, some with the Jews, some with the apostles. And I think I said verse 5 there. It says, a violent attempt was made by both the Gentiles and Jews with the rulers to abuse and stone them. And, I think we talked about it last week, that the Jews used the locals to stir up the locals because they didn't have the authority in a city like that to bring on the abuse. And it says their mission was to abuse and stone them. And stoning was a Jewish punishment, and then this abuse was to use them despitefully, mistreat in a shameful way. Sounds like much like how Jesus was taught as well. So then they went to Lystra and Derbe. So the apostles became aware of it. It's more than likely if you're there for a long time, you have friends and you have enemies, obviously, but then you have some people that are always going to ride the middle ground. They're not going to take sides one way or the other. And so with this, I would imagine that they became aware of it because somebody was like, hey, they're going to hurt you, and we don't agree with it. And they let them know, so they went to Lystra and Derbe. So it's kind of the surrounding region. They don't go too far with Lystra and Derbe. Lystra was just about 20 minutes. 20 miles. They don't have a car that goes 60 miles per hour back in that day, so it wasn't 20 minutes. 20 miles, probably a day and a half away. Southwest of Iconium. So they go, to the south of there. And Lystra was a very pagan city, okay? And we'll get into that a little bit as we go further down. And then Derbe was 50 to 60 miles east-southeast. So then they continued to go pretty far away from Iconium at that point. And Derbe was a boundary city of the Roman Empire. So the Roman Empire had all of their cities and all of their area that they'd conquered. And so it was kind of out on the outskirts of their boundary. And it's also often called a customs station. So when people came into the territory, they would come through Derbe and have to where they pay their taxes on any of their commerce they brought in. So you can imagine it's probably a very bustling, bigger city. And there was a great Roman road. Obviously, if you're a boundary city where you come in to pay taxes, there was a great Roman road that went from Derbe to Antioch. All right, so just kind of some background there. 2 Timothy 3:11. If I get somebody to look at 2 Timothy 3:11 and read that for me. Paul talks about these two cities. Second Timothy 3:11. Yes. So Paul remembers these places pretty vividly, the persecution he suffers in them in these different cities. So they become aware of the attempt on their lives. They leave to Lystra and Derbe, and then verse 7, just plain and simple, and they were preaching the gospel there. We've talked about this often, that the apostles, they went from place to place, and they preached. That's what they did. There's not much else to add to that, but they went and preached the gospel. So they come to Lystra. It was the first city that we talked about, 20 miles southwest of Iconium. And there was a certain man without strength in his feet, was sitting at a cripple from his mother's womb who had never walked. We'll read through verse 18. Kind of get the whole section here, and then we'll come back. This man heard Paul speaking. Paul, observing him intently and seeing that he had faith to be healed, said with a loud voice, "Stand up straight on your feet." And he leapt and walked. Now when the people saw what Paul had done, they raised their voices, saying in the Lycaonian language, "The gods have come down to us in the likeness of men." And Barnabas they called Zeus, and Paul Hermes, because he was the chief speaker. Then the priest of Zeus, whose temple was in front of their city, brought oxen and garlands to the gates, intending to sacrifice with the multitudes. But when the apostles and Paul heard this, they tore their clothes and ran in among the multitude, crying out and saying, "Men, why are you doing these things? We also are men of the same nature as you, and preach to you that you should turn from these useless things to the living God, who made the heaven, the earth, the sea, and all things that are in them, who in bygone generations allowed all nations to walk in their own ways. Nevertheless, he did not leave himself without witness, in that he did good, gave us rain from heaven and fruitful seasons, filling our hearts with food and gladness, and with these sayings they could scarcely restrain the multitudes from sacrificing to them." It's amazing all the different responses that Paul and Barnabas get at every single place they go to. Positive, negative, persecution, and this one just completely different, that they wanted to sacrifice to them. They thought they were gods. So Lystra. So what I could read about Lystra, most of the cities we've been reading about so far, where did they go initially to preach and teach? Synagogue, right? Oddly enough, at Lystra, it doesn't say they went to the synagogue. And everything I could read was that Lystra didn't have a synagogue of Jews. So what they did, and really an open, or even an open square. You think about, when I think about the open square, I think about Sodom and Gomorrah, right? When the two angels came, they went into the square and went into the center of the city, and that's where they were until Lot was like, come stay with us. And they're like, "No, we'll stay here." He's, no, you come stay with me. However, most cities at those times, at their gate, they had open areas where people would meet and congregate. I went back and if you read Ruth, where does Boaz have the meeting with Ruth's relative? At the gate, right? Because that's kind of like I said, it's open meeting area. It was open on the outside and on the inside before you got into the town. So this is kind of where, Paul starts here. He comes in there and he's kind of just teaching at the gate. And I say that because when we get in here, he talks about that the temple that was just outside of the gate. That's where they were. They were right there at the beginning of the city. And if we remember from New Testament examples of lame people, or even the lame person from Acts chapter 3, where were they? They're at a gate of some sort, right? The gate into the temple or the gate into the city. So again, that's another reason why it's a good assumption to make that they were at the gate. So, and why would the lame person be at a gate to the temple, or the gate to the synagogue, or the gate to the city? Right. He's going to beg there. That's where the most people are coming in and out, right? Constantly. You're going to get the most traction there. So that's where he's going to stay there on a regular basis to seek alms. Interestingly enough, we read in other stories, accounts in the New Testament, where somebody brings them and sets them at the gate, or brings them and sets them out. We don't have that. We don't really know the situation, just that he was crippled from his mother's womb. He never walked. So we have here, all right, very interesting comment I have on here. I don't know what that was at. But this man had never walked. So this man heard Paul speaking. So Paul comes in there, and Paul hears him speaking. Paul then sees him and observes him intently. It says, so this man heard Paul speaking. Paul, observing him intently and seeing that he had faith to be healed. Paul sees this man. Paul is the one that King James says he's steadfastly beholding him. It was a purposeful, intentful look. He saw this man. Paul and Barnabas are speaking, preaching, no doubt, about the power of God, who he is, his majesty, and he sees this man who is crippled from his mother's womb. And so it wasn't just a passing glance. Paul is almost studying this man to see. And he says here, and seeing that he had faith to be healed. Is this about the fact that the man had to have faith? Some people think, well, you don't have enough faith. That's why you're not being healed. Right? You haven't prayed hard enough, or your faith isn't strong enough. That's why you're healed. But this is what Paul is doing, is Paul is studying this man. He's observing him intently and understanding that this man believed that Paul had the power to heal him. This man's listening to everything that Paul is saying, and he's thinking, this man has power to heal me. And that's what he's saying here, that he had faith to be healed. He was believing and had faith that Paul could heal him. We don't know his age. Often there's been other accounts in the New Testament where they give the age of the person. He's of age, ask him, at different ages, but we don't know. But the faith to heal or faith to be healed is about the person doing the healing and not the one being healed. So we should remember that Paul is noticing that he had the belief in him. So then we go here, and then verse 10, Paul says with a loud voice, stand up straight on your feet, and he leapt and walked. So oftentimes in the New Testament we have, I command in the name of Christ, in the name of God, or something like this. That word is not used here, but Paul was obviously using his ability, his miraculous ability that he was given through the Holy Spirit and the power of Christ to perform this miracle. He tells them to stand up straight on your feet. So, there isn't a ceremony with this, is there? I often think about the story that Vance always used about the hat pin and the event where all the people were going to come and see the man be healed, and somebody took their hat pin out and poked the guy in that was in the coffin or whatever it was. I don't know the whole story, but I just think about that. There was a big to-do and a big ceremony about things, wasn't it? That's not what Paul was doing here. Paul had the ability to heal, and so what did he do? He just healed the man, right? Right then and there. There wasn't like, well, we need to wait. Let's wait. We get more people together. I'm sure there was a good-sized crowd, but he didn't wait anything. He healed the man then and there. And then the man did what? He leapt and walked, right? This wasn't a slow process, was it? Lame from birth. If you're injured for a long time and you are bedridden, your body loses muscle mass, right? I forget what that's called. Denise, do you remember? It's on the tip of my tongue, but I can't remember. Shell, do you know? Yeah, but you lose muscle mass. And so when people get the atrophy, yeah. I think I heard one of you two say it back there, so then it triggered me. Your muscles have atrophy, and you can't just get out of bed and walk after you've been bedridden for months. It takes time to build up your strength, doesn't it? Build up your muscles. You imagine this man's been crippled from birth. Do you think he even has any muscles in his legs? He probably has zero muscles in his legs. But what does he do? He just gets up, leaps, and walks. He felt that strength in his legs, and he's like, wait a minute, I can walk, and he just jumps up and goes. He didn't need therapy. He didn't need to go through more treatments. This was immediate miracles. So often today people go through cancer treatments and they are healed from their cancer and like, oh, it's a miracle. It's not a miracle. It's modern medicine. that they're able to do it, but it's not a miracle. Chuck, you're coming up here to speak. Yeah, that's great. Yeah. True. Yeah. Never done it before. You're right. That's a good point. Right. No. And little kids, we Brinson loved his bottle, so the only way we could get him to learn to walk is we put a bottle in front of him, and so he would get up and he'd walk towards that bottle. He didn't need any incentive though, did he? He felt his legs healed. He felt the strength. He felt like I have the ability to walk, and he leapt and walked without ever doing it before, without having any knowledge of how to do it, really. Yeah, and that's a great point the truck brought out. And it was immediate. So, you know, when miracles happen early in Paul's ministry or the apostles' ministry, people were amazed. Hey, this man a miracle was healed. They had all these wonders and all these questions. In this situation, of course, that's the Jews, but here he's at Lystra. Lystra is very pagan. So immediately, their response is completely different than what they have had before. And again, Paul didn't do this in secret. He's doing it at the gate where everybody is. There's a view of everyone, and so they all saw it. So the locals, and again, look in verse 11. Now when the people saw what Paul had done, they raised their voices, saying in the Lycaonian language, the gods have come down to us in the likeness of men. I don't know if Paul and Barnabas could speak the Lycaonian language, but they weren't there at Pentecost and received the miracles there that day and spoke in multiple languages and tongues. But it seems like Paul's probably speaking in Greek and their language, and these people understand it, being in the Roman Empire. But at this point, they go back to their native tongue, and they kind of go back to their native ways as well, don't they? They say the gods have come down to us in the likeness of men. And that's what they immediately concluded. Being a pagan nation, they immediately concluded that, oh, these must be the gods. And the reason we know about this is, like, so if we look at verse 13, and the priest of Zeus, whose temple was in front of their city. So there were two temples there of both of these gods that they mentioned. So they were convinced after this miracle that a man could walk, which is amazing to me if they have the temple and they have these gods that they can worship all the time, and they've worshiped them their entire life, the entire time of this cripple, why this man wasn't healed before. So, but their immediately response was that Paul and Barnabas were gods. They've come down to us in the likeness of men. So Barnabas they called Zeus or Jupiter, and he is the sky or thunder god, which is interesting because Paul will directly address that later on in verse 17 and really 15 and 17 about this sky and thunder god. And Paul was now Hermes or Mercury, the god of translators or interpreters, because he was a chief speaker. Apparently he maybe did some interpreting or translations for Paul. And then Zeus and Hermes versus Jupiter and Mercury, that's just different languages. Hebrew versus Greek, or I can't remember what the other one was. They were just different names, or different languages, uses of the names. So that's why you have them different. Latin. One's Latin versus, I think, Greek. So that's why you have different names. But if you look them up, they're going to give you the same information on those gods. So moving on to 13. Then the priest of Zeus, whose temple was in front of their city, brought oxen and garlands to the gates, intending to sacrifice with the multitudes. probably a common occurrence there if you have the temple that they are sacrificing to their gods. But their thought at this point is we now have the gods in our presence. We need to sacrifice to them. And they said, yeah, well, they brought oxen. Oxen is plural. We don't know how many, but they brought definitely more than one oxen. Maybe two, just because they were two gods. We don't really know. But they brought multiple oxen and brought them with their garlands, because the garlands were the decorations that went on their sacrifices, and they would be sacrificed and eaten by the pagan people. So they were making a very, very large event and spectacle of this. Now, again, very different than what Paul's experienced before. Sometimes he does a miracle and they immediately want to try him. That's what the apostles have experienced. But here, the people want to sacrifice to them, thinking that they are gods. They wanted to give a lot of glory to these two men for what they had done. And we're going to see Paul and Barnabas' responses here in 14 through 18. I think sometimes in today's world, we don't offer sacrifices to men. I think there's a lot of worship of men and preachers and teachers that goes on in the religious world. And we hold these men, which is just what they are, in a higher place than just being plain men. And we'll see here Paul and Barnabas' response. Was that what they wanted? Was that acceptable to worship them, to hold them in higher ground than what they were? Taken a hermeneutics class, and my instructor, he's had some difficulty with people saying, well, you need to take this and go and start doing things with it. And he goes, no, I'm not looking for the praise of men. I want to preach the truth. But people want to encourage him to do more with the teaching and take a place of preeminence. And he's like, that's not my job. My job is to go and preach and teach, not to look for the preeminence of men. And Paul and Barnabas give a great example here of how to handle that when we start to, of how to handle a crowd of when that. And I think it requires the speakers themselves to be humble enough to know that, hey, that's just not acceptable. But I think there's times that people just kind of get full of themselves. Look what I can do, look who I am, and look how well I do it. And they like that praise. They like that glory that comes with it. And we just need to remember that and keep things in check as teachers, for those that preach, and just as Christians, not getting to that point. Are there great preachers out there? Yes, there are. But as Paul says, they're just men. We are just men. They're messengers. They've been trained to bring us the truth, but they're just men. And we need to remember that we need to appreciate what they do and thank them for what they do, but they're not to be held at this higher level and worshipped like these people wanted to do with Paul and Barnabas, because that's kind of taken us back to a pagan, idolatrous things if we are worshiping and putting our ministers and our people, our teachers up on pedestals like they're somebody special. Any thoughts on that before we move on? I'm not trying to dig on any specific preachers. That's not in by any means. So I just hope you understand that. I just want to help us to remember that. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. No. No, we can't elevate people like that. We can't elevate ourselves like it.
And I think also about
And even Jesus turned it down. He said, "Why do you call me good teacher?" You know, he wasn't there for that either. And that's our examples. Um, and I think even people can get that with doctors. Doctor so and so, doctor this. It's the title. It's look who I am. So yeah, we have to be very careful with that. So, but when the apostles Barnabas and Paul heard this, they tore their clothes and ran in among the multitudes, crying out. The act of tearing your clothes, renting your clothes, was a common ancient action. I believe, from what I could find, this is the only time in the New Testament that it actually happens, that the apostles tear their clothes and rent their clothes. However, we have multiple accounts in the Old Testament of it happening. And I just went and looked at some of them, but Genesis 37:34, Jacob does this when he finds out that his son is lost. He tears his clothes and he mourns. Genesis 44:13, Jacob's sons do it when they realize that Benjamin could possibly be lost forever because the gold and money was put back in their sacks. Numbers 14 and verse 6, Joshua and Caleb, they do it when the Israelites refuse to enter Canaan. Joshua 7:6, Joshua does it again after the loss at Ai. And they lost at Ai because there was sin in the camp. But then we have David, Ahab, King Hezekiah, Josiah, Ezra. I mean, I can't list all of them right now. I mean, I could. I just didn't go and research all of them. But there's just a lot of historical examples of that when people were distressed of some way or dismayed, they would tear their clothes. Now, they didn't get naked, but they tore their garments, in an action there. So I think we have to be careful of that. So I think people could misinterpret that as they can everything. And I think a good point to bring out this is their dismay was not in private. Their dismay was public. They went out into the crowd to be like, ran out into the multitudes crying out. And, we'll see there in 15 what they're crying out. I think there can be times that we can be dismayed. We can be shocked, just kind of almost dumbfounded by the actions of people and the actions of non-Christians and even the actions of Christians. But so oftentimes we do it in private. Paul and Barnabas didn't do it in private. They went straight to the people and said, "What are you doing? Why are you doing this?" There's things that happen in the world. There's things that happen around us. There's things that happen in the church that we walk away from and we say, "Why is that going on?" But when we more than likely should do is in that moment say, "Why is this going on? Why are we doing this? What are you doing? This doesn't make any sense." And try to use that as a teaching opportunity. Now, a lot of us in this world today, they don't want the conflict. They don't want the results that might come of that. Well, I might offend somebody. Yeah. Jesus offended a lot of people. Paul and Barnabas, the apostles, offended a lot of people by speaking the truth. Sometimes we need to get over our sensitivities and maybe sensitivities of others and just speak the truth. Tell them the truth in love, obviously. You don't beat them over the head with it, but talk to them about the truth and say, what you're doing isn't right. And I can explain to you why it's not right, and I'd be willing to talk to you about why it's not right. And we can work on this versus just walking away and shaking our heads. Now, sometimes you have to walk away and shake your heads because there's nothing you can do, because maybe you've The conversations have been had, and people are not responsive to it, and there's nothing else you can really do. But I think, again, I just think this is a good example. There's always different things as you read the scriptures of different applications that you find, but they dealt with this stuff head on. Any thoughts there before we move on to 15? Okay. So they run in and they say, "Men, why are you doing these things? We also are men with the same nature as you, and preach to you that you should turn from these useless things to the living God who made the heaven, the earth, the sea, and all things that are in them." Why do you do these things? Like, explain yourself. Why are you doing this? What's the purpose? And just because it didn't make sense to them. Paul and Barnabas are preaching about Christ. They're preaching about the church. They're preaching about salvation. And they go right back into idolatry. And they're like, explain yourselves. Why are you doing this? And he says, we are just men like you. They weren't gods. They're just men, just people. The same nature as you. They have the same passions. That's what happened. These people saw this and their passions and their got stirred in them and they reacted in this way. But they're like, we're just men like you. We have the same passions. We have the same nature. But for them, they preach to you, he's saying, we preach to you, you should turn from those things. He might have the same passions, but they use them differently. They don't turn back to sin. He says there, and Paul spoke very similarly to the Jews about turning away from what they were doing, about God, about the living God who made heaven and earth, the sea, and all things that are in them. Paul's preaching teaching the same lessons he was teaching the Jews to this pagan nation. It says to hear the useless things, they refer to, he's referring to their gods as useless things. That's pretty harsh words there. You turn from these useless things, their gods and their temples, or vanities. They're empty, meaningless worship. Turn from those. And when you turn from those, what do you need to turn to? What's he call him here in verse 15? The who? To the living God, right? The living God. Were Zeus, Hermes, Mercury, Jupiter, whatever you want to say, were they living gods? No. They were statues in a temple. And so they were not of stone, wood, metal, or anything else, were they? So they turned to the living God, that living God that can heal you and give you salvation. Right? And what did that living God do? He says here in verse 15, it says that they made heaven, the earth, the sea, and all things that are in them. What is Zeus the god of? Said it earlier. He's the god of sky and thunder. But who is the living God? He made heaven, the earth, the sea, and all things that are in them. He is contradicting their beliefs in their God of what their God is. And he says that more in verse 17. It says he got that he did good, gave us rain from heaven and fruitful seasons. Again, that's very much saying your God who is dead is just an idol. It's useless. It's meaningless. It's a vanity. But we have the living God who provides all those things that your God does not. Jupiter and Mercury, they do not make anything. They haven't made anything. What other account do we have in the Old Testament where God is using something against God's little g? There was 10 of them. The plagues, right? God used Moses and all of those plagues to make mockery and to show the Egyptians who the true God was. Because every one of those plagues represented one of their gods. And ultimately, did the Egyptians have any control over those plagues, even though they had more than likely priests and prophets for their gods? No, they didn't have any control, did they? So God had all the control. So he says that he made the heaven, the earth, sea, and all things that are in them. God made everything and has made everything. And if you truly look at the evidences, you truly look at the Bible, you truly look at the world around us and design and everything that we have, it is obvious and we can see that God made everything. There is a higher being. Going on here in 16, who in bygone generations allowed all nations to walk in their own ways. Does this sound familiar? He said this a couple times before, right? About that. One we have here in Romans 1, 18 through 32. And then again in Acts, if we look in Acts 17, verse 30, he says, truly these times of ignorance God overlooked, but now commands all men everywhere to what? Repent, right? So he's saying here, he said, in bygone generations, in times past, you were allowed to do these things. Does that mean God condones pagan worship? No, it does not. It is not at all. He let them worship that way previously, but he doesn't let them worship. It is not allowed today, and it never was allowed. He says here, in bygone generations allowed all nations. That word can also be translated Gentiles, heathens, pagans. He allowed those pagans to worship that way. But we have new instructions, and that's what Paul and Barnabas are trying to do. They're trying to give them, this city, these people, new instructions on how to worship. I think we can squeeze in 17 and 18 here. Nevertheless, he did not leave himself without witness, and that he did good, gave us rain from heaven and fruitful seasons, filling our hearts with food and gladness. Now, God did not leave himself without witness. Again, going back to creation. Creation speaks of God. He did good, gives us rain from heaven and fruitful seasons, filling our hearts with food and goodness. God provides. These pagan gods were not providing, but God has provided, and has provided them everything that they needed. And we have, again, Old Testament witnesses, Old Testament examples. Of course, they didn't have this, but they had obviously could see nature, and they could see everything around them. That God gave them rain from heaven and fruitful seasons. Again, going back to Zeus doesn't do it. Zeus doesn't give you those things. God does. And with these sayings, they could scarcely restrain the multitudes from sacrificing to them. Even with the continued teaching, they still had to hold these people back from their pagan beliefs. And I think that's a good example and something we can apply today. When somebody becomes a member of the church, sometimes it takes work to hold them back from believing and doing things they did in the past, right? And we have to have patience with them. You can't expect somebody to become a Christian and day one know everything that has to be done and know how they're supposed to act all the time. We have to have patience with them, and Paul and Barnabas here, right? They're trying to teach these people the truth. The people want to immediately go back to their nature, go back to what they've learned their entire life, and sacrifice to what they believe with their gods. And they were able to stop them, but it says could scarcely restrain. It took effort to get them to do the right thing. And I think we need to be aware of that when we're teaching people, and we have new Christians in our midst, that it takes time and it takes effort. We have to have patience to keep them on the right path. It's not just about getting them in the door, getting them, baptized, and then we're done. There's still training and teaching and growth that has to happen. Sometimes we can be very impatient with people when they don't do things the right way, but Paul and Barnabas here kept working at it, and it scarcely restrained them. I mean, they were just continually trying not to, probably with just more teaching and more teaching and more teaching at that time to keep them from sacrificing. Especially when you're dealing with crowd mentality, it's like you get things going the right way, and somebody decides, well, but no, we want to do it. We want to sacrifice to them. You got to stop, start over again, and reteach them. Do we have any comments there? All right, we will end class there, and we will pick up in verse 19 when Paul doesn't have to deal with the locals. The Jews come and visit. So verse 19 will not be actually next week. 19 will be in 2 weeks, because next week we have a guest speaker because it's our second Sunday. So with that, thank you for your time and participation this morning.